Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional from Singapore, Mr. Philipp Kristian. Philipp, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Philipp is a keynote speaker and a visiting professor. He's a leading voice on trust, and he's an author on a book of books titled The Trust Economy and Reset. So Philipp, before we talk about trust, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief and what led you to become an expert on trust.
I think it is very much a question that it makes sense now. I'd like to think that trust found me. It's not something that I was particularly interested in as a child. I didn't think, oh, I want to be a trust guy. No. I've always been interested in innovation because I thought, okay, there's this immense power of ideas, right? That's how the world changes. As humanity, when we think of ideas and we can get a sense of trust in those ideas have a chance to happen. And that's, I really think, the reason why we've had such technology advances. So I was fascinated by that. And growing up in Germany, we are known to be a fairly high trust society. So, you realize whenever trust is there, things are easy. And whenever trust is absent, things get very complicated. In economic terms, we refer to this as transaction costs, right? But back then it was just fairly prevalent to me. So I kind of went through the entire journey of going on the innovation path. Doing that for large organizations, both in a consultative and an internal fashion. And then eventually realizing that really, if you think of the digital economy, the great innovation that the digital economy enabled was to make us trust things which don't physically exist. And that sort of then made a connection between the subject of trust and innovation that brought me back to really where I started. And I thought, how fascinating. This can't have been an accident, and quite the opposite. It really has panned out to be the path for me. And so since about over a decade, I've really, really sincerely put my mind to trust. And it has really been very revelatory.
So tell me, how do you define this word trust, and why is it so critical in today's world?
Well, in the trust economy, I define it as value realized. And to make it really simple, you can imagine this as a bridge, right? So there is a major difference between trustworthiness, meaning you deserve someone's time, attention, money, data, whatsoever, and you actually receiving that. So this gap you can think of as some sort of chasm, right, between the trustworthy intention and the action of trust. Now, this means that when we define trust as trustworthiness, we are missing out on the action which results from trust. So I define trust as really the behavior that closes the gap between the intention and the trust action. So that's why I defined it in the trust economy as value realized. Now, since I've evolved from there, I define it as basically the bridge between the intention of trustworthiness and the actual prevalence of trust. So that means if you think about Aesop's famous analogy, a bird in your hand is better than two birds in a bush. Basically, trust is the bird coming to your hand. Trustworthy is you being a decent human being and being a safe place for the bird to do so. That's the difference.
What a great example. Thank you. My next question, Philipp, is what are some practical ways individuals and businesses can build and maintain trust in the digital era?
Well, the case study piece that went into the trust economy as a book looked at 100+ signals. We don't have time for 100+, so I'm going to give you the most prevalent and the most important, which is simplicity. So the reason we tend to be skeptical around the world is when there is complexity. Complexity happens when your culture is different from my culture. It happens when your organization has different values than my organization. It happens when we speak a different language. All sorts of things that cause complexity, right? Whenever there is complexity, it is almost impossible for us, if not very hard for us, to establish trust. So the interesting thing is that the reason why the digital economy is trusted is because it makes things simple. And that tends to be the promise of technology overall, is that technology tools have made humans capable of doing things more easily, right? You couldn't really kind of mine iron ore with your hands, so you needed a tool for that, right? You couldn't necessarily discover properties in LA on your own, right, from wherever we are, but you need a technology platform to do so. So basically, it's the technology that has made things easy, and that's why a lot of trust has shifted to tech as well.
Very interesting. And how important is transparency, both personally and in the business world, when it comes to fostering trust?
Well, some people say it's really important. Some people say it's not. I take a slightly more balanced perspective here, because this is a function of, indeed, balance. If one side, let's say trust is a relationship always, this is really important because trust is about intention, action, and behavior, right? It can only really happen between two entities, meaning you and a company or you and an individual. So at that level, we are looking for balance. If you have 100% of trust in a company, but the company doesn't trust you at all, this is an unequal power relationship. Now, at that level, trust is not going to be sustainable because at some point it doesn't match, right? And that's a really, really dangerous predicament to be in. So you need trust to balance, which means this is true for transparency as well. Some people have said transparency is not necessary in trust. Some people have said it is the thing. But in reality, it's about balance. It's how much you give, you should receive. Trust is that level of balanced reciprocity. Then it is sustainable and lasting.
And, when you speak about trust, and when I was preparing for my conversation with you, you talk more about removing distrust rather than rebuilding trust. Help me understand this.
Right. Classic fable of the marble elephant. I don't know if you know this, but there's this sculptor that makes these beautiful marble elephants out of big blocks from the quarry, life-size elephants. And there's these visitors that pass by in awe, and they ask the sculptor, "How do you do what you do?" And the sculptor would chuckle and just say, "Oh, it's really simple, you see. I just take a chisel and a hammer and remove everything which is not elephant." Now, this is exactly how it works with humans, is we have trust in our nature, and the chisel and the hammer is technology, if you want.
Right. Okay. And Philip, what are some of the common misconceptions about trust that you have encountered ever since you started focusing on trust?
Well, the biggest one, and I'm certainly guilty of that one as well, is that you can build trust. That's what really the premise was of the trust economy. I think this is a semantic issue, but it's also a really kind of an issue of thought. Is if we want to accept that trust is in our nature, which it is, that is the human nature, is whenever we have the choice, we will choose trust. Whenever we can, we choose trust. So this whole idea requires a bit of a figure ground reversal, right? The figure ground reversal is that, basically we thought that humans naturally distrust, which is certainly true for animals, but it's not true for humans. The very effect of human evolution is that we are actually capable of trusting in large numbers. And that's what makes us such a great and interesting, society. So, yeah, or humankind, if you want. Now, this means the figure ground reversal is actually humans are trusting and trustworthy by nature. We are just so incentivized at times to give that up. And this goes back to the marble elephant, is because we reveal trust by removing distrust. You can think of this as when there's 100% distrust, there's 0% trust. When there's 100% trust, there's 0% distrust. So you can see how you really have two choices. But the removal of distrust, I think everyone will agree with you that matters. And then it's a question of how much distrust is necessary. So how far can you remove distrust so that trust is revealed? Whereas if you talk about building trust, people will say, but what about healthy skepticism and all those other things? So distrust, I think, is the more common denominator. We can all get on board with that.
Interesting. And when it comes to the corporate world, my question to you is, how can leaders demonstrate trustworthiness in their actions and decisions?
Okay, this is very important. You mentioned trustworthiness, right? To me, this is about, well, actually, if we accept that humans are naturally trustworthy and trusting, it means going back to our nature, meaning humanizing our leadership. And whichever way this pans out for you, there's a little bit of a caveat here, which is that we can generally assume the vast majority of people are naturally trusting and trustworthy, and there'll be a small subsection of people who may not be. In financial systems, we may call them bad actors, right? Now, the point is, that means as a leader, you must design fail-safe instead of foolproof. When you design foolproof, everyone's hands are tied and nothing gets done. Productivity, as we see it, does then tank, which is a big problem. What you want is to be fail-safe, so that basically you can make sure that the vast majority of people who are trusting and trustworthy can also be trusted. And then that small percentage can be accounted for. And that's also, again, where technology can be a tool for us to manage and identify the bad actors in the system without human judgment. And I mean this in every sense of the word.
And what would go into creating a culture of trust among employees and their employers?
This is definitely about humanity and humanization of work, because that's also where our productivity lies. Is if you take high performance teams, there's very little formal trust, and there is a lot of informal trust, meaning there's very little need for systems to support, and there is a lot of trust in the actual interaction. You can think of it almost as a sort of social dynamic, social contracts, right? So basically, to put it in simple words, a high-performing team is a team that has a high-performing culture. A team that is not so high-performing has perhaps a high-performing structure, which then somewhat tries to persuade the team to perform. But a high-performing structure is always inferior to a high-performing culture, because culture eats everything else for breakfast. We know this. As a result of that, trust really enables us to get to a level where we can rely less on structure and systems, and where those systems can be subservient to the human cause instead of the other way around. If you've ever filled out a form which you thought was pointless, you have become subservient to the bureaucracy, to the form. The other way around is better. This isn't to say that bureaucracy is bad. We need it at times. But whenever we have the choice to make sure that technology and systems serve us, that's obviously where we get a humanistic society. And who wouldn't want that? Let's be honest. Who would not want that?
Yeah, well said. And Philip, what would be some warning signs to watch out for that trust is beginning to erode, either in a personal relationship or in a professional relationship?
Complexity. What does complexity lead to? Like, look at the world right now, right? So that is a warning sign. The more complexity there is, ironically, the more of a warning sign there is around trust. Same with a relationship. If you suddenly have complex interactions with your spouse, that's a warning sign, right? And this is really, really important, because that's generally the case. Whenever there is trust prevalent, it's all very easy. Remember, this doesn't mean that that's trustworthiness. It means trustedness. You can be trusted without being trustworthy, which would explain some of the backlash that has happened in certain companies, certain organizations. Now, one really important thing here to keep in mind is you can be trusted without trustworthiness in the short term, for maybe a quarter, for a year. In the long term, you need to harmonize trustworthiness and trustedness. Right. Naturally, these have to align for long-term success.
Amazing. Moving on, can you explain the concept of digital humanity and why it is essential for our future?
Right. So very simply, human productivity has done a bit of a plateau. If we track this since the 50s, that's a piece of work by Yves Morieux with BCG, which I think is really, really insightful. But this, interestingly enough, also corresponds to when you ask people about the future. People who are more pessimistic about the future, they draw a sort of stagnating or plateauing or even declining curve. When you ask people who are technology savvy and optimistic about the future, and those things typically weirdly go together, you tend to have more of the hockey stick, the Moore's law, the kind of exponential curve. Now, what does this have to do? Well, basically, it means that depending on which generation we grew up in a different paradigm. And the generations of the baby boomers and the Gen X were the last generations that grew up in a sort of mistrust or distrust prevalent paradigm. That, with my generation, the Gen Ys, flipped. It was, I call it a digital inversion. So where all of a sudden we now have a default trust environment, and that is facilitated by technology, what we call the trust economy and the sharing economy. So Gen Y was the first generation to use the platform economy to the full extent. The Gen Zs now basically have, on top of that, built digital communities. So this is the creator type of generation and the creator type of economy. And then now the Gen Alphas, the very youngest, basically are the first generation to experience technology that is like humans, and at the same time experience humans that have become fully like technology in the sense of becoming digitized. That's what I mean by digital humanity, is where technology has become very, very human and where humans have become very, very digital. Wow.
Wow.
So basically, digital is becoming humane and humanity is becoming fully digital. So at that level, that's basically what the current growing up generation is experiencing. And that's really the point of digital humanity. It's also the point of peak productivity, because all of a sudden there we ride upwards.
Right.
And that's the promise of the digital age. And that's why we get excited about technology, because that's ultimately a really nice vision for humanity. Anyway, I hope this makes sense.
Yep. What a great response. Thank you. My next question, Philip, is that how do you see trust intersecting with issues like cybersecurity and data privacy?
Well, data privacy is a really interesting term, because here we can also talk about simplicity. In the past, companies have collected troves of data which are very, very hard to use and appropriate. At the same time, also customers may not necessarily be on board with that data being used. So the strategy that I would advocate for is data minimization. Because if you have a certain data point about a customer, which that customer agrees to have, you have. So like basically the customer is agreeing that you have this data point. Second, you know exactly the context of this data point because you know the customer, because the customer agrees to having shared this data, they also share the context. And third, you actually offer a value proposition which is based on this data point. You then have a sort of trinity where there is perfect alignment of interest. Now, this makes it vastly easier because it reduces complexity for you and it reduces frustration for the customer. This is but one example. You can substitute the customer for any human being and you'll get the same result. So basically, data minimization is the way because it allows for simplification and alignment of interests. So that's one part on data. On cybersecurity, the paradigm seems to be that technology is very good at distrusting and making distrusting easy. Whereas humans, we're very good at trusting. So what I've said over and over again is zero trust on a technology front may in fact make sense. But that has to be counterbalanced and counterweight by a high trust enabled in society and in groups. So to the extent that zero trust sabotages high trust in society, it is dangerous. To the extent that it supports a high trust inner circle where these vast majority of humans who are intending well, who are trusted and trustworthy, can interact on a level of trust that is high, then technology that pursues a sort of distrusting, a necessary skepticism type of function is useful. So how much distrust and mistrust is really necessary? That's the question which has to keep coming up.
Right. And do you see culture or cultural differences impact in trust building efforts in a globalized world?
Yes. You can think of it this way. If you want to put one axis, the x-axis as being the level of trust from, very, very much distrust prevalence to very, very much trust prevalence. Like, remember we said like 100% distrust means 0% trust, 0% distrust means 100% trust, right? So then you would have a spectrum, and it's not that some cultures trust more than others, it depends on what the cultures trust in. So for example, in America, very individualistic society, we have a fairly high trust in the individual. But now I'm going to add the y-axis, which is crucial. That is the number of human beings involved. So think of it as the flight height. How big picture are you? One interesting example about the US is trust at the very high big picture level, the big ideas, is also very high, right? So now you have an example of a society which has a very high trust at the individual, n equals 1 level, and at the n equals infinite level, right? However, trust in family might be somewhat lesser, trust in institutions might be somewhat lesser, trust in companies might be somewhere in the middle. Now, for every culture, you can draw a graph like that. You can say, how much trust is there in ideas? How much trust is there in the state? How much trust is there in society? How much trust is there in companies? How much trust is there in family? And you basically arrange all the different institutions, all the different concepts which you like, according to how big picture they are. A family with, let's say 5 to 50 members would be, so somewhere at the bottom, right? Because it is fairly small. And an idea, for example, something like capitalism or humanism would be very much up here. Now, then you can basically plot the trust patterns of different societies, and then you understand why we miscommunicate sometimes across cultures, because we simply trust different things. It's not that Singapore trusts more or less, it's just that there's a high trust in government here. That high trust in government may not be the same in Sweden or in France.
Fascinating. So one more question about trust, and then I have one question about your book.
Yeah.
What, in your view, are some of the ethical considerations that leaders should keep in mind when they're navigating trust-related issues?
The first thing is you simply cannot afford to be not trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
If you wish to think for the long term. Now, we see in the stock markets, which are often short term, that even the companies pursuing short term trustedness, meaning receiving trust, not necessarily deserving that trust, will eventually correct. This is true for the GFC. It is certainly true for the tech economy. It is true for, in the long term, everything. That basically, everything corrects at some point, right? If you don't agree with that, that's fine, but that tends to be the tendency, because in the long term, right, the discrepancies between trust and trustworthy will become fairly obvious, especially in a world which is transparent and where information is everywhere and accessible. So you basically have to invest in being trustworthy, and that means being a decent human being. If you are part of the 90+% who already identify with that, great. If you're not, it's still worth investing in, because it is a better success factor in the long term. However, when you rest there, you will understand that investing in trustworthiness does not pay off in the short term always. So you may then be overrun or eclipsed by someone who is investing in trustedness before trustworthiness. At that point, fret not, do both.
Okay.
Because you will finish the marathon, you will win the battle. However, you may have to put more effort in at the beginning. So there is a strong incentive for you to say, oh, I'm just going to be trusted. Who cares about being trustworthy? But if you're a human being that is naturally trusting and trustworthy, that will create somewhat of an internal conflict. It won't feel right. So go with trustworthiness and trustedness. And honestly, if you do this in a structured and systematic way, you'll find that being trustworthy doesn't cost you any extra, but it actually allows you to be much more value generating, because it allows you to take trust from a transactional, opportunistic level to a much higher, more universal level. And that's actually the deal breaker, because if you as a leader are trusted universally, not just for your position, it means that this trust extends to anything you want to do. So if you want to innovate, your team will go with you. Right. If, however, you are only trusted as a finance leader or a marketing leader or an accounting leader, that trust is fairly limited. So in order for you to get trust to be at a universal level, it has to be somewhat trustworthy, right? If, however, you want to stay at a transactional level, you can probably do away without trustworthiness for a while, albeit ethically that would be wrong, but it will catch up either way. So two things. First of all, it will catch up with you if you're not trustworthy. And second of all, the more universal and valuable your trust, the more trustworthiness has to play in.
Wonderful. So I've got time for one more question, Philip, and I want to ask you about your book, The Trust Economy.
Yeah.
Tell me about your book, and what was the hypothesis when you decided to write the book?
It was basically the digital inversion. So the idea that the sharing economy returned us to our natural trusting tendencies. And as a result, by making trust easier, it facilitated a dramatic uplift in productivity and also humanity in business. I think we can verify this to be true for a large extent. But of course, this isn't to say that the digital economy has only created good things. And in fact, the irony is that we coexist in the digital economy and in the offline economy. So in the offline economy, we have this distrust, inflationary distrust, necessary but annoying, and complexity as a result of that. In the online economy, we also have tendencies of overtrust, right, where we are compelled by the simplicity. Right. And so the trust economy basically highlights this somewhat contrasting dynamic. Nowadays, I see this as humanity doing a bit of a Van Damme split, and us now having this challenge and opportunity to bring those worlds together and reharmonize. And that, I think, is the message going forward, also now that 6 years have passed since the book was published, and it's been published in various languages. Really, from there, I think now what I'm definitely concerned with is how to reharmonize humanity along dimensions where the offline and online societies can mutually enjoy a healthy level of trust, and where also we can have a certain amount of distrust and a small amount of distrust, which keeps things in order. So if you think about it, vast majority of people are trusting and trustworthy, small amount are perhaps not, the level of distrust in society should be equivalent to that small percentage instead of equivalent to the big percentage. So you can think of it like, and the metaphor I use often is like salt in the water. A little bit of salt in the water adds flavor, and maybe it's fancy. Fancy mineral waters tend to have a little bit of minerals and salt. Yeah. The moment that you have too much salt in the water, it becomes completely useless for human consumption. And that actually, we haven't reached that level yet, but when we reach that level, basically that water will no longer be potable and we'll be in trouble. Right. So the appeal is, let us use technology to balance so that we have as much distrust as is necessary and as much trust as possible.
Amazing. And on that note, Philipp, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey, your own amazing understanding of trust. Thank you for explaining to me the difference between trust and trustworthy. Thank you also for speaking to me about so many different aspects of trust in a digital economy. Thank you again, and good luck.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.